If you're building an onboarding program from scratch and there isn't a SME dedicated and there aren't clear standards, that's going to be the first thing you're asking. What are the standards of excellence here? What are we hoping that these folks are going to be able to do? What does proficiency look like? What does really going the extra mile look like? So we're giving them kind of that jump pad. And you see that a lot in the tech industry. They're simply learning the standards and how to have these conversations with excellence. And one of the other challenges is competing priorities and what the business is willing to allow in terms of how long a new hire has to kind of acclimate and integrate. So there are usually like parameters you're working within as well. It's all about finding out what those standards are, asking questions, and then socializing them, because then you have this new list of standards that might not have been the norm. And then you sort of have to kind of rebrand certain things around communication. It can be a lot of fun. It also just kind of depends on what questions you're asking, but ultimately to set up the new hire for success. If we're building out this very specific onboarding, it means everything else has to be very specific too.
Aaron, it's really good to have you. Thanks for joining. It's been awesome to get to know you recently, having met through sort of your recent sort of award nomination through OnCon, and looking forward to just learning from you on all the different cool work you do in L&D and training at Live Nation.
Yeah, Vince, I'm super excited to be here. It's been awesome getting to know you, and I'm excited to just have this conversation. I could talk about it all day and all night, so
Yeah.
I'm really excited.
Awesome. Well, this is the first time we're really diving into the specific topic of onboarding and how to make it a great experience. I know that you're like a real expert in this, so I'm very curious to dive in. Yeah, so maybe let's just start by asking, what do you think are kind of the three differentiators or factors that allow onboarding to be really good for folks instead of being really generic?
Yeah, I think I have seen it change and transition a ton over the last, I don't know, like 7 years. This kind of like steady progression. And I think when most folks think about onboarding, typically you think of a more orientation style experience where it might be a day and there's a presentation and you're being oriented to the company or the organization and the leadership and competencies and these broad ideas and culture, um, that kind of curated content. And I think while that's really important, we're seeing this kind of progression to this like next step, which is more about this more role specific, individualized experience. And so when I'm thinking of a generic onboarding, which is what I would equate, and generic not being like a negative term, I just want to like clarify it, but this more kind of all encompassing or general onboarding, um, versus a more role specific experience. Um, I think a lot of it boils down to just context and like contextual relevance.
Mm.
Um, I think an effective onboarding program that's been mapped out specifically for a specific role or an individual, it's going to tie directly into their day to day responsibility. So, if we're providing relevant tools, examples, scenarios, we're kind of getting their hands and what they're going to be doing on a day to day basis. I think automatically you're taking it from that more generalized experience to a more effective experience. I think one of the main questions new hires have is, what's my day to day going to look like? And a lot of the times, onboarding at scale, it's really hard for folks to answer that if they're not like a direct leader of that team or
Mm.
so I think making it relevant and the context of which they're going to be working is one of the best ways you can do that. I also think skill application is becoming so important, and it's becoming, not that it hasn't always been important, but it's being prioritized more. And I think giving folks, rather than this like broad company overview, which I think is important, but I think it could be boiled down to maybe an hour call
Mm,
on like a day one kind of thing, not like a full day experience, but making sure that these new hires are having the chance to actually practice the skills that they'll be required to perform.
mm,
Um, and then seeing this structured progression over a period of time. So when thinking of onboarding, I think folks, they have the 30, 60, 90-day benchmarks. And if you do something at those 30, 60, 90-day benchmarks, whether it's asking for feedback or having a conversation, you can like check it off a list. But what's happening in between, like days 0 to 30, day 31 to 60, day 61 to 90? And then I think once you actually start to map out that middle and the map out the complexities, and you actually start to map out a progression of skill over those 90 days, that's whenever it really becomes effective. So just to
mm,
kind of recap, making it contextually relevant
mm,
and their day to day, what they'll be doing, having some application component of skill, and then having a true skill progression over some extended period of time before they're actually expected to perform.
really interesting.
Yeah.
And I think the three things are really helpful, and it sounds like it really is about helping answer the question, as you said, what does my day-to-day like look like what's the actual job. Sounds pretty hard to do at scale, though, as you mentioned, right? Like it's easy to do for a smaller group, but so how are you tackling the concept of scale when you're trying to bring this type of experiential, like tailored experience?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. It's something that I'm kind of in the midst of now.
Mm,
Um, I think it really depends on what the function of, like what your function is,
mm,
right? So if you're centralized in an organization and there's like one L&D team that's overseeing all onboarding and training, um, I think there are a lot of pros to that, but then there are also I feel some cons, or not necessarily cons, but just opportunities and some challenges that you can work through. But I think um I I think it boils down to how intentional can you be with the folks that are going to be leading the charge. So are you
mm,
delegating tasks to these individual, if you're working in an organization that has multiple divisions, or like I said is kind of decentralized, then you'll have to have some sort of game plan if there's a centralized function of L&D. So is it working with those key teams and building a framework of onboarding curriculum that
mm,
can be um, adapted? And so I think when thinking of scaling, if you're working in an organization that's decentralized, because there are like kind of two different thoughts that I like, pathways
for
that I
sure.
think.
Yeah.
So if you're in a decentralized organization, then the onboarding program would have to be adaptable enough that any team could kind of plug and play what's important for them. And typically, like in a large organization, there are competencies that everybody kind of adheres to. So I would say that's a great place to start. And understanding what the vision is, what the goal is, because competencies are what skills, behaviors, the way that we all kind of operate as one cohesive unit, right? Effective communication, um, you know, problem solving, those kind of like big umbrella terms. And then how is that applicable for the folks on this team? That's where I would start with building out a framework that could be scalable in a decentralized org. If the training function was decentralized across the organization,
Mm,
which, like it just kind of depends on like the structure of things, but then it becomes about, and this is something that I actually kind of struggle, not struggle, but um I'm in the midst of navigating currently, is um folks that are spread out across like a large geographic location. Like if a team operates nationally, then how can you scale an onboarding program with limited resources so that the integrity of the program is maintained no matter who's like leading the onboarding? So really arming managers, hiring managers, people leaders to effectively onboard. And so I think for me it's been a lot of training the trainer and making sure that managers have the tools to lead onboarding in a way that I would, with the same intentionality, with the same, care and then having that like high level oversight and making sure things are getting done. So I think in a decentralized or in a more like centralized function, that would be a really great way to approach scale. Is definitely leaning into train the trainer, um, and arming those people leaders to set their teams up for success. If it was a more decentralized organization, and the L&D team was centralized, I would say making sure you have that really well thought out, structured framework that bubbles in to the competencies of whatever the organization, like whatever is important to the organization, and then mapping day-to-day responsibilities to those behaviors.
Really interesting. Yeah, so it's very much mimics what it takes if you had really like high touch live training programs or something, and or like just rolling out initiatives, you end up having to really bring those like sort of local leaders or champions up to speed. I would love to dive a little bit into more specificity around the experience. So you mentioned like making contextual and then, making it like applicable and also having follow through. Can you give me an example of what that actually means? Like maybe with a specific role and as an illustration?
Yeah. So let's say maybe not specific to my org, but like let's say we were onboarding a client service specialist, and this was somebody that directly worked with clients, and it was that transactional experience where they were solving immediate problems for the client, mediating, like a customer service representative or something to that effect. So if I was onboarding or building an onboarding program, um, I what I would have to do first is really just like break down, okay, what are the key kind of like pillars of this role? What are they ultimately responsible for doing? So if that's, answering phone calls and fielding client requests via phone, fielding client requests via email, so like email communication, and then if it was like de-escalation, de-escalation or emotional regulation during conversation or having hard conversations. So more of that like general communication or relationship management. So I would start with like the high level kind of, not, I guess you could call it like a competency, but the main behavior. And then I would map, for example, like if it was a customer service representative, I would say, okay, answering the phone and using these phone scripts is a key skill within this like bucket of phone communication. And so if I was making their onboarding contextually relevant, then there would 1000% be a good chunk of their experience simulating those phone calls, listening to experienced team members have those phone calls, receiving feedback on their own application or of the skill or whatever they're demonstrating. And so within the onboarding framework, having those like built-in scenarios, just depending on what the role is or what it calls for. And then, and that sounds easy, right? But I mean, if if you're somebody that's building out these sorts of programs, you're usually pretty out of touch. And so like you're not the person
Yeah.
that's, like you're not the
You're not the
person.
SME, right? You're like, yeah.
You're working with them. And so I think one of the biggest things that I've learned in my experience is knowing the questions to ask when working with these experts, or a lot of the times it's managers. And so it's not always like a subject matter expert, because if a lot of the times you're training on skills that are kind of like common, right? Like they're common skills, communication
Like
skills.
a foundation, basically.
Exactly. Like this foundational layer of just, performance. And a lot of those things are challenging to observe in an interview, I think, depending on the hiring practice. So if you have somebody come in and they're not quite at the level that the manager would feel comfortable to being on the phone, and like de-escalating a challenging conversation, or making somebody feel validated or heard, or kind of saving like a conversation. It's uh how can you have this like base level of standard? And so one of the things that you'll run into, or I've run into, is if you start asking these questions, a lot of the times there isn't an answer. There's not a clear answer. And so if you were to say, hey, like manager over this large team, what's the standard for this specific scenario? So if it's, you know, if like a customer was really concerned or upset about something specific, like what are the steps of resolution? Um, and sometimes I feel like there are just these kind of understood rules that aren't always worked into training materials, or they're not disclosed, and then it kind of becomes it becomes the person on the team or the new hires responsibility to learn by failing, um, and then being coached around these kind of foundational things. So if you're building an onboarding program from scratch and there isn't a SME dedicated and there aren't clear standards, that's going to be the first thing you're asking is, what are the standards of excellence here? What are we hoping that these folks are going to be able to do? What does proficiency look like? What does a level above proficiency look like? What does really going the extra mile look like? How can we train people on what that looks like from the jump? So we're giving them kind of that, that jump pad. And you see that a lot in the tech industry, right? Like they do the ramps and they are training folks on specific products, and they spend, months. I mean, they'll do like a 3-month ramp where they're not even on the phones. They're simply learning the standards and how to have these conversations with excellence. And I think that's, one of the other challenges is competing priorities, and what the business is willing to allow in terms of how long a new hire has to kind of acclimate and integrate. Some orgs will allow for an extended period of time, some not. So there are usually like parameters you're working within as well. And so it's all about finding out what those standards are, asking questions, and then um, socializing them, because then you have this new list of standards that might not have been the norm, and then you sort of have to kind of rebrand certain things around communication, or then there might be some retraining that needs to be done. So it can be a lot of fun. And it also just kind of depends on what questions you're asking. But ultimately to set up the new hire for success, right? Like we want, um, if we're building out this very specific onboarding, then it means everything else has to be very specific too and intentional. Yeah.
I was actually smiling the whole time, or in, like going through, because as you were saying, It's so funny. We're doing something like exactly the same for a financial services company, onboarding for a client-facing sort of team,
Mm-hmm.
and really going through this exact process right now, right? So, um, building an onboarding thing, to your point, is more application based for them.
Yeah.
But first defining what does excellent client like communication look like. The standard is not very clear right now. So you're trying to set the standard,
Mm-hmm.
um, and then building scenarios around it that are realistic with
Yep.
like call listening and like discussion and stuff like that. What's really striking, at least from my experience, is that there are a couple levers that are pretty important to pull to make the onboarding work. I'm curious if you agree. One is actually when you define the standard, making it something that's simple enough that everyone can easily remember. Like there are, like, to your point, like unspoken substandards of excellence, but no one ever explicitly thought them. So there's not a good
Yeah.
articulation of it, right? So
Yep.
your actual first job is distilling from different people, like, well, what is excellence, right?
Yes.
So first is like, how do you articulate that? And then second is helping people see what is mediocre, good, great, and outstanding
Yes.
display of the skill look like? Because to your point, it's rarely black or white. It's actually like you look at something, oh, this person did like this well, but this is actually not very good.
Yep.
Or like this sounds really good, but actually it's pretty bad. You know, like actually there's, and so you have to like make that those gradation be explicit in the process. And anyway, so we're working through that with a client right now, and like everything that you were saying, I was like, yes, like this resonates.
Yeah, and it becomes like, I don't know, like I always think whenever I first started doing this sort of work, um, my background's in music, right? So performance. And so my a lot of the feedback that I received like in college and in my master's program was it was very subjective.
Right.
And so it was very much about musicality and like effectiveness of like emotion and like display of emotion and storytelling and these things that aren't black and white. And so I became very accustomed to that sort of like those like nuanced sort of situations, and receiving feedback on those things. And then when I'm in this corporate landscape and I'm looking at folks, I mean, if you're on a client call, right, like in essence, you are performing. So it is very, and we're not performing, right? Like we're being genuine, we're being authentic and those sorts of things. But there is this kind of like fourth wall
Of course.
situation.
Yeah.
And so I think it's interesting because it isn't always black and white. And so it does have to be approached a little bit differently. And how can we help people that aren't accustomed to that, like articulating that sort of feedback? Because a lot of the times it's in the hands of the manager. And if the manager doesn't have that experience in articulating that sort of feedback, how are you training them on how
Exactly.
to provide this more nuanced situational feedback? And so I think a lot of what I found is it comes like it's like the handy dandy rubric. Like I mean, I had so many different sorts of rubrics for competitions I would do, and like did XYZ invoke this emotion like on a scale of 1 to 5,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
and it's very subjective. But what I have found is I do something called skill checks
Mm,
at that's it's a task that happens within that like 30, 60, 90-day window
mm.
and those key benchmarks. And it's really so new hires have the chance to demonstrate skill and demonstrate just how they're building on what they have a very specific list of skills, kind of centered around the key, the most important parts of their role. And it's not everything, right? Like it can't be everything. We can't teach and perfect everything. But if we lean into these key things in these specific areas like communication or relationships, managing relationships or finance, um, and we can get like 60% of it really, really well, and we can become proficient like a 3 out of 5 on that scale and those things in 3 months, what a win. You know what I mean? And those skill checks, it's interesting because, we start with just kind of gaining an understanding of how it's kind of a self-assessment. So within that first window of time, they're really self-assessing, like what is your general understanding?
Mm-hmm.
And then it gets more into, okay, let's have a conversation about it and explain to me, right? It's very much that, understand, explain, execute. And then giving folks a chance to demonstrate skill, and then the manager using this sort of nuanced rubric to provide feedback. And it's a good exercise for the manager, it's a good exercise for the new hire, and it also helps build their relationship too, and like that, facilitating that feedback loop. And so I think it's all very interesting when we're talking about some of these things that could be subjective and how we're preparing folks for success. Because I think a lot of people can have a conversation and they have those more introspective insights, and it comes naturally for some. And for some folks who don't use that more creative part of their brain as often, or it's not their dominant, then it could be more challenging. And then it's like the integrity of feedback isn't the same. So then we're like talking about standardizing the feedback loop.
Right,
And
right.
so, you know what I mean? So it's super layered. But that's where it gets really fun, in my opinion.
Very cool.
Yeah.
Okay, I think I got a pretty clear perspective of what you meant by the actual experience of an onboarding. Thanks for using the example to bring it up to life. Now, let's go back a little bit to the scale question we had, where you mentioned, train the trainer might be a good approach to do it. Now, in general, as you scale, you really end up facing typically a couple of challenges. One is like consistency of quality, right? Is like usually there's some erosion of quality as the layers of train the trainer goes down. Also, how do you balance standardization to tailoring, right? So I'm very curious how you think about, maybe let's first think about the standard of quality. Like how do you maintain that as you expand the size of the onboarding program?
Yes. So, yeah, that's a really good question. I think what it all boils down to, I try to think of everything and kind of consist in a consistent light, right? So if I think about it in the same way, if I'm teaching a new hire a specific set of skills and I was to go through a 2-week program with them, and then I didn't check in and reassess understanding or reassess, the ability to explain concepts or execute or demonstrate, then I think there would be a chance of that more like decline or watered down kind of execution of skill.
Mm.
And so I think about it in a similar way with scaling a program. I think there has to be high level oversight to any sort of standardized program like this. So somebody has to own it. So I think having somebody in that position over the program and have those key benchmarks and assessment periods to make sure that the folks, whether it's regionally or in like specific marketplaces or national, global, like whatever it is, like I love the program manager role. I think it's a fantastic role for an organization because somebody that's managing the effectiveness of a program like onboarding or a specific leadership program or something that has a consistent like pipeline, um, that's going to be key in my mind as like a step one. There needs to be that high level oversight, and there needs to be step two, a very specific set of things that we're ensuring are maintained. So I would say like having the folks go through that train the trainer, it would have to be a biannual or annual thing, where we're kind of retraining on how to facilitate the program, there would be some, consistent feedback from not only the facilitators of whatever the program is, but also the participants. So those things I would not want to centralize to like the specific market or region. I would want that program manager to kind of have eyes on all of that feedback that's being aggregated so that there is still kind of like a centralized line.
Mm.
And then those just success benchmarks, and making sure the program effectiveness is being assessed. So having that like specific list of like a rubric of things. So whether or not that's based on participant feedback, whether or not that's based on, time to proficiency. So are we measuring, if we see some sort of gap in this specific area of a region or a market, but then we're not seeing it over here, then like what's happening over here? And is that something that we can control? Is it not? So data will become very important in maintaining the integrity of a program at scale like that. And it just becomes about asking the right questions, in my opinion.
Yeah, really, really interesting. Let's talk about the sort of the success metrics that you talked about. Can you share a little bit more? Like, what have you measured in the past? And sometimes you would set up metrics and they sound really nice, but either they don't actually get to the core or they're so hard to measure that like it's not very actionable.
Mm-hmm.
Curious what you've done before to strike the right balance.
Yeah. So whenever I came into my organization, there were no metrics. This is a brand new space. And so I actually racked my brain, like, how do I measure if this is successful or not outside of learner satisfaction or program satisfaction, right? That's one of the only metrics that you can, without a shadow of a doubt, get because it's a simple question on a survey. And it is a very superficial metric. So one of the things that I was really, I wanted to be sure that I was showing from like a business alignment standpoint, because efficiency is such a big thing. At Live Nation, working well quickly is this time to productivity, and that required a lot of work on the back end, right? Like time to productivity is really showing how long it takes for a new hire to reach these expected performance levels. And so when I started coming up with these metrics, I realized, okay, what is that time frame? What is the expectation of the organization? Do I have 2 weeks? Do I have 30 days? Do I have 90 days? I remember when I originally, I was talking about this with leadership, and it was a pretty quick turnaround time, which is to be expected. I think organizations want their people up and running quickly. So it's really not to their fault, but I think realistically, if we're wanting folks to perform at like a proficient level really fast, then there needs to be that at least that 90-day window of time. And so once you determine what the time frame is and how much time you actually have to play with, then you can develop these key benchmarks and like timestamps. And once you have those time marks, whether it's 30, 60, 90 days, or if it's, 45 days, that's the only benchmark. Then you can do this like middle mapping. That's the hardest part. Then it's setting these key moments in time where you can, without a shadow of a doubt, say, this person can do this, yes. This person can do this, yes. This person can do this, yes. And then obviously you're measuring that against whatever time frame you have.
Mhm.
So if there are 280 tasks that a new hire is expected to do within 90 days, and they could do 260 successfully out of 280, then, we have some sort of baseline metric. And then what is that 20-point gap? And then it's us going back to the drawing board and saying, where can we be more efficient? Where can we optimize this activity or make it more specific or make it more intentional? Loop in this conversation for clarity or whatever it is to get these folks completing all 280 tasks within 90 days. And then that's like a really great baseline metric, right?
That's actually, I
So,
love that you've broken down like a role into these very discrete tasks that are so small that at that point it's like binary. Can
yeah,
you do this or can you not do this?
yes. Yes, exactly. And that's the hard part. And that is, and at least for me, right? Like in my experience, that was a really challenging thing because it just required so many conversations and asking the right questions.
Right.
And for me, I have always been, it's honestly like an insecurity of mine, like not knowing what questions to ask, especially in the corporate landscape, because of my background in music. And I kind of joined the corporate landscape later in life because of the pandemic. And I had this really interesting skill set, but then I was kind of out of my wheelhouse in terms of skill. And so a lot of this has been rooted or born from what would have been helpful for me, which was intentionality and a really specific roadmap. And so once you get in there and ask the questions and you know who to ask, and then you know how to confirm what's right and what is ideal and what isn't, and you kind of like start chipping away at all of that, and you come out with this very specific list of things, then you're golden. And then you just kind of get to, you can automate it, right? Like that's when you can actually start to become very efficient. So you take those 280 tasks, cool, they're getting done now in 90 days. How can we get it done in 45? And then you can really start to show your work.
Much more actionable at that point.
Yeah. Then you have something to work off of. But I think that's where organizations don't always understand like the baseline and where you're starting. But if you put your nose to paper, or whatever the phrase is, pen to paper, and you can spend however much time. For me, it took me a couple of years to like, for the specific roles that we're onboarding and the complexity and the nuanceness of them, it took a long time to figure out what that list is. And then once you have that list, it's just it evolves. But then it becomes proactive and less reactive, right? You're adding to instead of starting from scratch.
Right. You
And
know
so yeah,
what?
that time to productivity is like a big one for sure.
You know what's really striking to me is recently I've had conversation with people in the like L&D HR space who are talking a lot about skills-based movement, like skills-based organization, and the importance of tasks actually. Because tasks are more measurable. They're a little bit more observable. Skills are like a little abstract.
Yeah.
Um, and I don't know if I must actually have been intentional, but like you're basically building like a skills based organization, both onboarding as the initial like wedge
Yeah.
in that journey basis. That's
Yeah.
what it seems like to me.
That's like my own little agenda. Don't
Uh,
tell anybody. I'm a huge fan of the skills first framework.
mm,
Just in general, I think it's beautiful for hiring. I think it's great for onboarding. I think it's when you're looking at the person holistically and what they're capable of and what they can
mm.
actually do versus what they've done and what's on their resume. Not that those things are important, because they are, but I think it's a very small sliver of what what the reality is, you know. um and so I think for me, focusing on skill is so much more actionable than um I don't know, like handing somebody a checklist or saying, go watch these courses and then you're going to have a performance review in 90 days. It's like, well, are we actually setting them up to succeed?
Yeah.
And are we setting up the business to be successful? Like if we're being really intentional and specific around skills from the beginning, saying, these are the kind of conversations we expect you to have with your clients. Like these are the kind of things we're expecting you to extract. This is the type of relationship that we really value with, at this organization. And this is how we treat our clients. And this is how we show that sentiment, right? Like this is, if we can get that specific, it's a lot of work up front, but once you have it, like it just makes it very hard to fail. Then you have a team of people that are probably very willing, or you have a team of people that are capable, excuse me, and then it becomes a matter of will. Like if you're giving people that much of that strong of a like a springboard, then it becomes a
I'm
lot
buying
easier
it.
to,
Yeah.
it's, and I think it just is, it's a much more fruitful experience, and the outcome will be more fruitful for like everybody involved.
Yeah. I guess, for sure. Like, and just, I hadn't quite think of it onboarding this way, but I kind of really am starting to link it to the general skills based framework. And the fact that the way that you're incorporating the onboarding is like really cool. Um, is the real, like, let's think about like an organization that's not doing this today.
Mm-hmm.
Is the biggest challenge that there's actually a lot of work to be done up front and there's no clear owner to do the work? Or like, I'm curious, what's the thing that is so difficult that more organizations haven't done this?
Yeah, I think it is a lot of work. I think it goes back to competing priorities and the folks that typically, if there isn't a designated training function and there isn't somebody in that function that is thinking innovatively, then either they might be kind of stuck in what's been
Mm,
and maintaining.
mm,
And so then you have the challenge of bringing in new ideas. And then it's like, if you have some sort of process in place, um, I honestly feel like if you have the right framework, this becomes very easy. It's just a matter of uh, delegating, delegating the tasks and responsibilities to get it done, because it does feel like a lift. It would require a lot of uh, consulting with leadership,
yeah.
because ultimately it depends on what leadership deems as the standard and whether or not they have the time to have those conversations, just depending on what's happening in the
Mm,
business at that time. Or I think it that is like the, what do they call it, like the bottleneck, like that's where it kind of gets stuck, is because it's almost like you're extracting some of this institutional knowledge out of
yeah.
folks
Yeah.
sometimes, and you're trying to get people to say or confirm things that you, like you said earlier, that are just, they're kind of understood. And I hear this often in many of my experiences, but like we hire people expecting them to be able to do the job. And I agree with that. And I think it is very subjective. Like anybody can build a relationship with a client, but if it's not in the way that the organization expects, then there needs to be training involved.
Yeah.
It's like, um, so I think, yeah, to answer your question, it becomes a time thing. and not having the resources or the designated uh, person to get the project across the finish line. Yeah.
Yeah. So fascinating. I want to get your thoughts actually on how this starts to evolve as organizations start to use AI more. I'm curious
Yeah.
how you're thinking about it today.
Yeah. I think it's incredibly exciting. And I think that's a great, what's it called? Like caveat, not a caveat, but just going off what we were just talking about. I think using AI to help map out skills is like one of the most efficient things that an organization can do. And somebody that doesn't have necessarily maybe the brain wiring to do this sort of work, it's a good starting point. I think AI is really good for building out those like adaptive learning paths and the general frameworks and some of those things that are when we were talking earlier about scaling and we have two sort of options, right? Like, are we creating a program that we're scaling in a centralized way where everybody in the organization is consuming the same program and it's being centralized into like one HR function or or whatever it is. And then it's being kind of like delegated out to specific team leaders, or is it a more decentralized situation where everybody's kind of doing their own thing, maybe using the same template, but I think AI will be really great with helping to build out those adaptive learning paths. So personalizing the onboarding content more dynamically, right? And like offering these resources based on individual progress.
Mm.
And it will also help with that performance metric data component as well, because if you can automate certain things using AI, which I've used AI in some of the work that I've done, and it has been instrumental. I have a very small team, and I don't think we would be able to move as quickly without it. And just doing some of the more menial tasks, things that shouldn't require a lot of thought, you know what I mean? And not necessarily the strategic work, but um, that's one way I think in building out the frameworks for those more customizable learning paths. It will still be, in my opinion, unless the organization like dumps all of their, you know, standards, expectations, all competencies, all of that into some sort of GPT, then there will still need to be some ownership over the content that's being created, because it's hard to do that with AI currently. I think, at least in the way that I've seen and used, like there still needs to be some serious like tweaking with
For sure.
from
Yeah.
folks.
It's contextual, right? Like,
Very
yeah.
contextual. Yeah.
And how do you think about so I agree with that, by the way. I think it's a really exciting promise.
Yeah.
At the same time, onboarding feels like the best onboarding programs today are very social, and there's something beyond just performance. Like, there is actually just like the human element of joining a team and building a sense of belonging and motivation, right? So that
Yes.
you're like more than just like a collection of task
Yes.
executing sort of capabilities, right? So I'm curious how you think about that, balancing skills-based onboarding.
Yeah. So I think it's, and I speak so much about this more tactile stuff, because it's where I've had to kind of overcompensate because I am such a more like when I say experiential, I almost am referring to like one of the onboarding programs that I admire so much is I love the way that Disney does their onboarding and
Mm,
having like their culture days, and I love Airbnbs. They have an amazing onboarding program, and it's all based in experience and like memory and tradition. And I think one of the ways that I've tried to do that at Live Nation in the capacity I've been able to is helping new hires see how what they're doing on a day-to-day basis impacts uh, the live entertainment industry and live music and the product that they're contributing to, and millions of fans having the experiences of their lives. And like connecting, that's something that gets lost, I feel, when you do that more general orientation, is that it just, they don't have the insight. The people leading those initiatives don't always have the insight to connect, to make the connection to like this finance budget that you're managing is like this festival over here or this show concert over here is a direct result, and like this partnership excelling over here is a direct result of. And so, one way that I try to inspire and motivate people from the beginning is connecting that dot to, you're the foundation of all of these other amazing things happening. And without you, this would not be possible.
mm.
And so that actually has been, I've gotten a lot of good feedback based off of that. And I think that's one way any organization can do it, especially if there's some sort of community benefit or, um, whatever the product is or whatever the company, like whatever service they offer, like what's the result of the effort, and then connecting it back to what that new hire is doing on a day-to-day basis is how I try to balance it out.
Very cool. Aaron, thanks so much for joining and sharing your insights in like such a structure, but also with specificity. I think it was really cool to just think about onboarding in a very systematic and thoughtful way. And it gives me also a lot of food for thought in terms of how we think about, new team member onboarding at Sparkwise.
Yeah,
Um, so thank you very much.
you're welcome. It was my pleasure. Thanks for having me. And yeah, I look forward to hearing and watching more of these podcasts.
Awesome. Thanks, Aaron.